Good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to thank all the people at the Sandra Kaplan Beit Din for inviting me to do this. Whenever I can be on a program with Elliot Dorff, who was one of my earliest teachers and mentors when I made my own transition into the world of the rabbinate, it's a pleasure. Rabbi Zellman, I have not met personally until this moment, meeting electronically, but I've known about him for a long time and followed your work, and I'm a great admirer, and it's an honor to be on the same program with you. Before I actually begin this talk, I would just like to mention a couple of years ago, I edited a chapter for a new textbook on gender confirming surgery. This is a medical textbook called Religious Attitudes Towards Gender Confirming Surgery. And in addition to the part that I wrote about Jewish attitudes, there are sections by Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim theologians. If anyone is interested in a copy of that, not that it relates particularly to conversion, but in seeing how other religions think about this, I put my email address in the chat. You can email me directly. I'd be happy to send you a copy. I'll also send a copy to Muriel so you can be in touch with her to get a copy of it. 8 years ago, almost to the day, May 5th of 2015, I spoke at a Yom Iyun for this same group about many of these same issues. That was 2 years before the tshuva had been completed, and a lot has changed in these last 8 years. It's also, I should mention, 20 years since the first tshuva passed by the Law Committee of the Rabbinical Assembly on this issue by Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz, which is part of what got me thinking about the whole question of conversion of transgender Jews and other issues related to this community. I'm not planning to give a lot of background because I think probably by this time, many of you have had experience meeting, working with, converting, doing, just being with members of this community. I do plan to leave a significant amount of time at the end of my speaking for Q&A. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the background. I do want to say that in the work that I did preparing for the tshuva, the one underlying principle that guided the whole effort was that anatomy is not determinative of gender, that gender assignment or gender is made on the basis of gender identity. And if you want to know an individual's gender identity, you have to ask them. There's no necessarily fixed anatomical markers that we can apply. I would also mention that in preparing the tshuva, there were a lot of people who helped me, particularly two of my students, one at JTS in New York and one at the Academy for Jewish Religion, who studied bioethics with me, who both transitioned after their ordination. They were great help, as well as others, both within and without the trans community, in advising me on a lot of the matters that were under discussion. There were a couple, couple of big challenges that I face. And one relates particularly to what Rabbi Dorff talked about earlier this morning. That is that although halakha itself is binary in terms of gender, people are not, or not necessarily. And as he pointed out, the rabbis recognized that there were individuals to whom that halakhic binary did not apply, and they were willing to apply halakhic decision-making to the individual as seemed appropriate. Now, I don't know exactly what the rabbis meant by androgynous or tumtum or tharis or ilonit in terms of what we would call those people today. Personally, I don't think any of them are what we would call transgender or non-binary. But in terms of values, we can see that the rabbis were saying there are people that we have to look at as individuals and apply halachic principles, not in a simple across-the-board way for as either men or women, but look at how they apply to the individual. And that rabbinic principle, I think, is as valid today as it was then. The second big challenge is that Judaism is an embodied religion. And let me just read for you one brief passage from the chapter that I mentioned related to other religious attitudes. And this is a quotation from a person named Ashley Moore, who is a trans female Christian minister and founder of the world's first all-transgender gospel choir. And Ashley has said, transgender persons seem to be an acutely spiritual people. Perhaps this is because once you reach the point of saying that who you are transcends your physical form, then you are immediately aware of yourself as a spiritual being. I think that is a beautiful thought, but it runs in Jewish tradition, it runs up against our way of paying attention to the body as well as the spirit. And that notion of Judaism as an embodied religion provokes certain problems, some of which Rabbi Zellman and the other speakers alluded to that I will get into in a couple of minutes. In Rabbi Rabinowitz's tshuva in 2003, he made the statement that once a trans person had undergone gender conforming surgery or gender confirming surgery, that they became the new gender for all purposes. The problem was that many trans people either do not want or are not candidates for or cannot afford gender confirming surgery. And it doesn't even begin to consider non-binary people who may not want or be candidates for gender confirming surgery. And therefore, by establishing gender on the basis of gender identity rather than anatomy, we get around that problem of requiring the individual to undergo surgery, but that in itself creates other kinds of problems. When I first started working on this tshuva and dealing with these issues, two of the most common questions that I got were, as was alluded to earlier, first, who should be the witnesses of the immersion in the case of conversion to Judaism? And although in my mind, this is not really a halachic question, because anybody really is technically able to witness it, but issues of modesty, issues of dignity, issues of comfort, they all have to be taken into account. I can tell you in New York, I participated in a lot of conversions as member of Beit Din, because I was also moil. So I was often asked to participate, particularly in cases where hatafat dam was necessary. And at the mikveh we used in New York, the general rule was that the immersion was witnessed by rabbis of the same gender as the conversion candidate. And often in the case of female candidates, the female mikveh attendant would be the witness rather than any of the rabbis. I remember getting a call from one of my colleagues, a cisgender male rabbi, that he had a conversion candidate, a trans man, who had asked this rabbi to witness his immersion for the conversion. And this rabbi told me that the candidate had not undergone any surgery. And although he had trained this person for the conversion, he felt very uncomfortable about being the witness for the immersion. And we talked at great length about, I asked him what made him uncomfortable about it. And in the course of our discussion, he realized that this was really his problem that he had to deal with, because in this particular case, the person who was converting, they knew who they were, they knew who the rabbi was, they specifically asked him, they wanted him to do it, and he eventually did, and it all worked out fine. I will tell you also, I used to be on the Beit Din for a lot of conversions done at Congregation Bet Simchat Torah. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Sharon Feinbaum's shul in New York, which was established primarily for members of the LGBT community. And their policy was that their rabbis never witnessed the immersion of any of their conversion candidates. They always asked the conversion candidate to choose friends, colleagues, whoever they wanted. They brought them to the mikveh with them, and those were the people chosen by the candidate, whether it was the same gender identity, the same gender expression, whatever it was people chosen by the candidate, but it could not include the rabbis. The rabbis just did not do it as a matter of policy. So the first rabbi who introduced the program, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, said that at the Beit Din you've established policies, which is great, especially if they're working for your program. The next big question that I was asked, and this has proved to be a very, I would say in many ways, a very contentious issue, is what candidates require either circumcision or hatafat dam in order to convert. Now, for trans men, whether they have undergone gender-confirming surgery or not, it seemed to me, and there's really been very little current controversy about this, that neither circumcision nor hatafat dam brit are required. There is no organ to circumcise or do a hatafat dam brit on. There are some conversion candidates in those categories who want to do hatafat dam brit, and if they want to, there's certainly no reason that they should not. And again, we should find ways to make it easy and comfortable for them to do so, but we don't need to require it of anybody. Similarly, trans women who have undergone gender-confirming surgery, that is, specifically what we refer to as bottom surgery, there is no requirement for either circumcision or hatafat dam brit. The difficulty arises in many cases for trans women who have not undergone gender-confirming surgery, that in the tshuva, as if you've read it, my opinion is that those patients, those individuals require either circumcision if they've never been circumcised, or hatafat dam brit if they have been circumcised. I have a colleague that I just ran into a couple of weeks ago in Shul, and she told me that every year she teaches this tshuva to one of her classes, and almost every year before her class starts, she calls me to ask if I've changed my opinion about this very question, because I get calls from rabbis. I have a trans woman candidate who has not undergone surgery, who is just refusing to have hatafat dam brit, and it is heartbreaking for them, and it is heartbreaking for me, and it is difficult to give an answer that is satisfactory in those cases. I should mention that there are cisgender men for whom this is a deal breaker also. I once was asked to participate in a conversion of a cis man who had been married for 25 years, and he professed no other religion. During those 25 years, he accompanied his wife to shul. He was an active participant in the community. They observed all the holidays, but he would not undergo circumcision in order to convert, whether he was afraid or uncomfortable or just didn't want to go through it. And then after 25 years of marriage, he developed cancer of the penis, and the treatment required circumcision, the medical treatment for his cancer. Once that treatment had been carried out, he had no further impediment to his conversion, and he converted soon after that. So I recognize that with trans women, it's more of an issue than just the fear or concern about the procedure. And most of it comes from the fact that, what is the biblical imperative? The biblical imperative says, Himol lachem kol zachar, that this applies to every Zachar. And since that is usually translated as male, they feel they are not part of that, and it is offensive to them to be asked to undergo this procedure. Now, what does Zachar mean? To me, this is my personal interpretation. I think Zachar, as it's used in the Bible, is what we today would refer to as assigned male at birth. I think that's what it means. And it is a requirement for Hatafam Brit or circumcision that is based solely on anatomy. By basing this solely on anatomy, it seemed to me that this then also deals with non-binary, other gender non-conforming individuals. And it's not saying that your gender is not what you say it is, but this is the embodiment piece of it. And this why is like a double-edged sword. If you have this kind of anatomy, this is what is required. Just as halakha about Torat HaMishpacha refers to anyone who menstruates, whether their identity is male or female. And, you know, after the recent Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, we have heard talk about the effect that will have on pregnant persons or persons who can become pregnant. And in that, I think the trans community wants to remind us that there are people who can become pregnant who are not women. So that was what led me to make this decision, recognizing that it would be problematic for many people and not seeing a way around it. Only final comment I would make before taking questions is, in this regard particularly, I would say that this tshuva is not Torah Misinai, and it may take another generation. And I think having trans rabbis who understand the life experience as well as halakha, that's who may find a way to get past this requirement that ends up being an impediment to conversion for I don't know how many people, but surely for some people. Anyway, I'm going to stop there, take questions either from the floor or from those on the chat. Rabbi Sachs.
I put in the chat. You were talking about applying the rules in halakha regarding the ritual act of circumcision and hatafat dam brit, and spoke specifically about trans women and trans men. But many non-binary people, in my experience, do not consider themselves men or women. And the change of anatomy, if there's a gender surgery, does not necessarily mean that somebody now considers themselves a specific gender, necessarily. So I'm wondering why we would think to apply a gendered system of rules to a person who is not gendered in the ways that you and I might feel gendered. It might make more sense to say, since those rules don't apply, we should develop a ritual that would be meaningful and maybe one that uses the body, because we're an embodied religion, and conversion is not only a spiritual commitment, but one that will be an embodied commitment as people participate in communal life. Why can't we go in a direction like that?
Oh,
I'm missing something.
Pardon?
I think I'm missing something and why we would apply rules for whom they, to people who don't apply.
Okay, so to answer your first question first, why can't we come up with some other ritual to apply to non-binary people? Is that
correct?
Well, I think we can. I mean, I would, if you want to do that, or somebody wants to do that, find a way to do it. I think that could be a good idea. I think there are other strategies that can deal with this problem. I think one might find a way, for example, to say that Hatafat Jam Brit is not necessary for anybody. You could, that would be a different strategy, and say, we just don't have to do that at all. Not on trans people, not on non-binary people, not on cis people, not on anybody. I personally don't know how to do that. I didn't think of that, but if somebody wants to look at the halakhic method and the halakhic literature and find that way, kol hakavod, why not? So yes, I don't know what the answers can be. Finding another religion, another ritual, that might also be a valid strategy. I would ask the question, and I asked out of ignorance, and I don't know if there is even necessarily a single answer to this, whether non-binary people to whom neither male nor female genders apply consider themselves to have no gender, or a different gender that is neither male nor female. So I don't know whether they consider themselves non-gendered people, and maybe some do and some don't. I'm not sure it's all one or the other. So I just don't know the answer to that question.
Go ahead.
I can actually answer that question for you here. Hi. So it's very complicated, but ultimately there are people who do believe they are both male and female. Some believe that they are only one, but feel it just a lot less than other people. That's called being demigender. There are people who are gender apathetic, where they just don't care and don't abide by anything, and that would be one of the people who don't have a gender. It's a wide spectrum. So do you have like a specific question further to try to help explain this more?
Let me, I'm gonna have to jump in. I want to be sensitive to time here. We actually said we were going to conclude at 1 o'clock. I'd like to get a sense of the room, whether we can extend our time, virtual room or physical room. I know that many of us would like to ask questions and explore this more, and it would be a shame to, in my opinion, for us to lose out on the expertise that's here and virtually present. So is that okay? Maybe 15 minutes? Okay. And if it keeps going, it keeps going. Okay. So did you want to keep going?
Yeah. So is there any clarification I can make in terms of what you were confused about in that regard?
I'd actually like to ask questions based on that, so not confusion of that clarification, but if you can repeat it. Great.
Yeah.
Right. I was
I'm gonna repeat it. No,
Okay,
well, we got it.
so- Yeah,
We got
you got it. So, if we go as Zachar Nekeva as this assigned at birth piece, which I find problematic because then if you do go through a surgery, you'd still have had an assigned gender at birth and you'd still need to do Hatifat Brit based on that definition. So if we use that for this one very specific subset of people who haven't gone through surgery and still have that genitalia, why does that discount? Right? Like why use that one definition for that one piece?
Okay, so I'll attempt that. You're saying that gender from at birth, if we go with the idea that gender as defined by our physical bodies at birth is the definition that we use for our decision making at the time of conversion, then why would it stop at the time of conversion? Is that sort of the essence?
Well, for instance, Hatifat Brit, right, is one drop of blood.
Hatafat Brit is one drop of blood, yes.
So if you were assigned male at birth, if we go with that definition of Zachar being assigned male at birth, but you went through and had a surgery and no longer have male genitalia, you were still assigned male at birth. So
Right.
why is that you don't have to do Hatifat Brit, but if you were assigned female at birth, or you're assigned male at birth and haven't had the surgery yet, because you haven't had that surgery, you are required to do something, even though that definition hasn't changed.
Right. And so I'm not sure.
Do you want me to phrase it?
What's that?
Is for Rabbi Sharzer.
Yeah, Rabbi Sharzer, did you hear that, the
I,
essence of it?
I did not.
Okay, why don't you just come up? Because I think,
Telephone was gonna work pretty good.
yeah, I know, I appreciate the question though.
So my question, Rabbi, is if you use Zachar as this definition of, you didn't just see me to hear my voice, but okay, as assigned gender at birth for the specific subset of people who haven't gone through the transformation in surgery, why does that discount people who were assigned male at birth and did go through surgery, right? They were still assigned male at birth. According to your definition, they are still Zachar. So why aren't they doing Hatifat Brit if it's just a drop of blood? Which, by the way, I'm not acknowledging that. I think there's a definition problem with Zachar and Nekeva, but if it's assigned male at birth, why are only people who either haven't or couldn't go through the surgery required or beholden to that rule?
Okay, because in order to, for someone to require Hatafat Brit for conversion, they need to, one, have been assigned male at birth, which means have a penis, and two, have had a circumcision. That's what Hatafat Brit is done for. Someone who was previously circumcised. Now, just as a cis male person who was assigned male at birth, who suffered amputation of the penis for treatment of cancer or from trauma or whatever, that person does not require Hatafat Brit because there's no organ to do it on. So if there's no organ to do Hatafat Brit on, it's not required. Okay, so that's why someone assigned male at birth who now identifies as female, but has had surgery which removed the male genitalia.
Well, but that's the one jump. And by the way, I appreciate the jump, but the one jump is in those transformative surgeries, it's not always that your genitalia are no longer there. They've been transformed. So I still think it's, if you're going to stick with male at birth, you end up with creating an issue where you're only holding one subgroup to that, even though the other one, if we're playing definition games, they do still have their genitalia. They've been reassigned. But even if you look at what the surgery is, it all depends on which surgery you go through as to how much of your original genitalia aren't still present. So I'm still a bit conflicted when it comes to why one group is beholden to it and one is not. But there's a bunch of other questions, so I'm happy.
Yeah, so why don't we, Robin, would you like to come up? And you can be on camera, that'll help.
Okay. So you can hear me?
Yes.
So, okay. So I'm still not seeing the leap between when you began your talk, Rabbi. You said gender is not anatomy dependent, and yet, so I'm not seeing where how you felt compelled to translate Zachar as assigned male at birth. And I have talked to transgender colleagues who say if they had been, most of them were born Jewish, but some became Jewish, and if they had been classed as Zachar in order to become a Jew, it would have been anguishing. It would have been horrible. And it seems to me that, okay, the way that someone said it to me is as follows. If I'm a woman, if you accept, and in your use of pronouns I read the tshuva, and your use of pronouns and your description of people is very compassionate and accepting of people's self-identified gender. So what somebody said to me, if I'm a woman and I have female nose and I have female elbows, then I have female genitalia. How can one part of my body not be female regardless of what it looks like? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And in fact, we're grown-ups, we can say penis. And in fact, colloquially, people talk about girl penis. I mean, there's a whole new vocabulary now. Yeah.
And of course, the geneticists will also identify different male and female anatomy as being connected in the genetic journey of an embryo into a full life. And so some of the distinctions we think of are complicated by modern genetics. I think they're getting it. So do you want to add a response to that, Len?
Yeah, let me just say one thing. I appreciate all the concern and I appreciate the questions, and I think they're real and valid. As I mentioned when I started out, the 2003 tshuva required that in order to be considered the new gender, people had to have undergone gender confirming surgery. And that was what I wanted to get around, to remove that requirement, since so many trans people were choosing not to get gender confirming surgery, and I still wanted to be able to consider them the new gender. So therefore, I felt saying, okay, your anatomy doesn't define you. You can be a man with a penis, you can be a woman with a penis, if you say you're whatever you are. But doing that and saying, okay, we will accept you as what gender you say you are, regardless of your anatomy, it opened up this other problem. And I think if somebody could find a way to get around it, I mean, I was very aware writing this and then talking to advisors that I was working with who were from the trans community, who we all recognized that it was going to be a problem facing a lot of people, but I didn't know a way to get around it. And I also don't know if we were to make some change so that this was not a requirement, what you would say to a parent of a newborn with male anatomy, a baby boy, a signed boy. They say, well, we're not going to do a Brit at 8 days because when he grows up, he might tell us he identifies female. and we just don't want to do it. And maybe they're uncomfortable doing it anyway and are picking up this as a reason. So I think when we're finding ways to say, okay, this person with male genitalia does not need it, what other complications we're going to, other unintended consequences may follow that. I don't know what they're going to be, but we should be prepared for them.
Thank you so much for that. I'm so sad that we have to close out our questions. I was asked to give closing remarks. I also want to say to folks here that there is a lot of extra food. Thank you, Muriel, for that.
And there are
takeaway boxes so that you can have dinner. And it might look a little familiar to lunch, but it's okay. Just a quick summary of some of what we heard today. It was wonderful. We started off from Elliot, you sharing sort of how the rabbis, with their rudimentary understanding and really no understanding of psychology. I mean, there's no representation of what's going on in the mind of the individual. They were responding to, a WYSIWYG approach. What you see is what you get. And out of that, they attempted to find structure and meaning in what was not yet called a transgender or a non-binary. They had different language. And then we heard from you, Ruben, telling us about how reading those texts inspired you in the sense that you suddenly felt a sense of inclusion that you didn't know was part of our, that was a highlight moment of you sharing what it was like to read those sources, because now all of a sudden there's a sense of I'm on this planet and there's a place for me. And then that really continued with learning from the two of you about your own experiences along the way. A couple of things that sort of jumped out to me is, Dorian, your experience with the Hatafat Dambrit and the urologist or the Mohel not knowing, it kind of begs the question of, do we have a list yet of Mohalim or Mohalot or urologists that are, on the list of go to this one and they're understanding and affirming and supportive. And then we also discussed the question, and Rabbi Sharzer pointed it out in a different lens. Do we give the candidate for becoming Jewish the option of choosing who their witness or whatever we want to call it, their accompanist is, or do we have that individual bring a friend? Perhaps we put the same kind of restrictions on it the way we do, that it be a Torah observing, whatever our view is of who the witness is going into the mikvah. I would argue that we need to do more than both of those things. I think we also need to ask questions about how our mikvaot are recognizing modesty. And there are certainly ways. I mean, the experience with you, Dorian, was wonderful because I didn't have to really look per se. I mean, there's this idea that, but the candidate doesn't know that until they're at the mikvah, that that the Eidim don't need to be so observant, so to speak. We need to bring that a little more to our attention. One of the reasons why we need a liberal mikveh here in Los Angeles, I'll put a plug for that as AJU goes through its steps. And the last thing I want to say that we didn't discuss, despite our title of Sacred Transitions, the journey of non-binary and transgender Jews, we have to acknowledge a huge category that we did not touch on, which is the question of the day after the choice of becoming Jewish and actually fulfilling the obligations and the traditions and the dip into the mikveh. Are our congregations affirming and supporting and recognizing the special challenges that go with sort of being a double challenged individual in a world where transgender and non-binary identity is always a hot topic, which means there's an extra focus on that individual, and the ongoing challenge that we talked about last year about how do we welcome Geirim into our communities. That's a question we did not address today, but it's something we need to keep talking about. So I think with that, we will call it to a close. Grateful for everyone, including those on Zoom who joined us, and have a wonderful day. And thank you. Thanks so much.